Olympic skier if he can do this.
I was always a ninja. Ninjas.
It's true. All right. Unless you found a pirate, and then they disagree.
Making sure I have Jason in the shot just because he's gonna have a lot of gold written in.
That's just a cultural thing.
All right, so we're live now. Everybody wave at the camera. Say hi.
Hello.
I think we only have like this half of the room, so you guys can like do whatever, and nobody will ever know.
That's right. They'll hear you, but they won't. They won't know.
Oh, let me turn off music. So, tonight, I just wanted, like, with Ratio Christi, we're a ministry that really wants to get into the hardest questions, whether that's philosophical stuff, whether that's science stuff or history stuff, or social issues and things that are happening, things that are current to the culture that are viewed as controversial, and things that generally, I think groups, especially Christian groups, oftentimes have a little bit of a fear and trepidation jumping into the nitty gritty of an issue. And so with that, one of the things with everything that's going on these days, we wanted to talk about racism and realizing how much that's affecting our culture, everything that's going on from the riots to the things with George Floyd that kind of sparked so much of what's going on now, to injustices that we know that are happening, and how, as Christians, are we to respond to all of this? And we don't want it to just be a short and quick conversation that I think a lot of times Christian ministries will do regarding an issue like this of, hey, don't be racist. Great, see you later. Have a good week. We want to get into that a lot more in depth, because I think ultimately, especially an issue like this, it's hard to navigate the waters because politics play into this. And it ends up sometimes in an issue that shouldn't be politically charged. We should just be able to look at it and say, hey, racism is bad. I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, we should work to fight racism. And instead, it ends up being people saying that one party's racist and another party isn't racist, and saying that the policies of one party are racist or whatever else, and not figuring out how we can work together in that. And because of that, a lot of churches aren't willing to get into the real nitty gritty of what do we actually do. As Christians, obviously, we look at it and we know the Bible is against racism and we want to fight against that. But then the very practical thing comes along of, what does that look like? What do we actually do to fight against that? Is it just simply, hey, don't be a jerk to somebody who's the opposite color of you? Or are there things that practically we should be doing as the church to fight against that? And I think biblically, we see that there is an element that it can't just be, and this is one of the ways that separates Christianity from other religions, is we are supposed to go out and seek justice, to seek mercy. And in that sense, we aren't just supposed to say, hey, well, I'm not a jerk to people of the opposite race of me, and that's good enough. Instead, Christianity says, hey, I see people being prejudiced against somebody because of their color or because of their ethnicity, and I will step in to stop that. And you especially see that in the Old Testament when you read through, especially after the fall of the first kingdom, or of the kingdom, the fall of the first temple, and they rebuild the new temple. And then again, prophets kind of come out and say, hey, like, you need to get back to following the Lord properly. And a lot of their stuff is not as much like, hey, you're not doing the temple sacrifices. You're not doing the temple laws and the different things of like not eating pig, or different laws that we look at and we maybe are like, I don't understand why God really cared about this or that. It's less of that stuff than it is, you're not taking care of the poor and the needy, and that's why you're not following God. And that that shows the heart of God, that he seeks justice, and that is much more important to him than these smaller rules that we hear and we read about when we go through Numbers and Leviticus. And not that those things aren't important, those are still things that are important and apply when we put those in the right biblical context. But overall, God cares more about that heart, and he cares more about making sure that we are doing what we can to take care of others. And the church, I think, oftentimes then struggles with, okay, well, then how practically do we do a lot of this? And this is where the politics comes in of, do we look at it and say, well, if there's people that are being treated unfairly or are coming from conditions that are worse off because they were born in Harlem compared to somebody who was born here in Fort Collins, which is well off in a more of a white city for sure. Is there a way that we need to be making sure things are evened out in that? And how do we do that? And what is the best way of doing all of that? And so much of this as well ends up becoming, especially for those of us who do grow up in a city like Fort Collins, as I did myself, some of us just don't know and understand what's going on in all of this. And so much of this is also looking at what James says of like quick to hear and slow to get angry. And so in that sense, we shouldn't just respond to anything when it comes to racism. When it comes to all this stuff, a lot of what we need to be doing, and part of our responsibility, is to say, hey, let's ask questions, let's learn and discover. And that's even what we talked about with last week, and a lot of it when we talked about the Columbo tactic. A lot of that was just talking about, hey, when you hear somebody that disagrees with your viewpoint, or they say something that you're like, that doesn't add up, or I don't feel like that's right, instead of just immediately attacking and saying, this is why you're wrong, you ask questions and you understand their perspective. Because chances are there's things, especially regarding this issue, with whatever race you're coming from, there's experiences and things that people of other races have gone through that you haven't. And so you just don't understand it. And so you need to be quick to listen to what they have to say, rather than to respond right away to what they have to say. And so I wanted to just have this as a time to kind of discuss a lot of this stuff. I didn't want to necessarily put any one person under pressure to discuss all of this. Obviously, we had Jason being willing to come and join us. And those of you who can see the camera, all of the rest of us are white. And I tried to get a couple other of my Black friends to come and join us, and they weren't able to join us, but that's the way it goes. And that doesn't mean now that Jason is the voice of every Black perspective ever. Yeah. But he is going to be able to kind of, I hope, bring some perspective to all this conversation and help us to kind of think things through in a different way. And Alan, I know, has done a lot just kind of researching a lot of this and talking with a lot of people from different perspectives, and even looking at the more academic questions in all of this. Because one of the things we definitely will hit on is critical theory, because that's really important in this, because there's some ideas in that are kind of being Trojan horsed through the whole Black Lives Matter movement that is not biblical. And that's not to say necessarily that all of the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole is bad, but there's some things that we need to look at with a good biblical perspective to kind of think through. So with all of that, like, I don't know if there was some opening thoughts you wanted to even share, or we could even just start kind of throwing out different questions and things that we're all thinking through in this. It's not something, again, that I'm putting you on the front of it.
So I guess before we start off on the thing, obviously we get very, very political in this discussion, and a lot of sometimes what the debate is centered around, in a way, is policy, especially on a governmental level of some sort, right? And we could talk about that. That's totally fair. But I would generally say there's, I don't think we could say there's not Christians and well-studied and well-meaning Christians on both sides and all ranges of the political spectrum, right? So do we want to focus more in on what do we think the church should do versus what do we think we should do like politically or on a policy based level?
Mhm.
Because we can have a policy debate, but generally we're not the like politic club, right?
Right. No, I think that's a great point.
And so, I just don't know if we want to focus it in more on that, like what do we think the church should be doing, / what do we think we could be doing within our communities and churches,
Right.
if anything, or various different things, as opposed to, well, I think that we should do reparations or whatnot, because that's maybe a political debate that we don't want to mire in, and people who are Christians probably and well-meaning and well-studied probably can make good arguments for both sides, right?
Mhm.
So just as a
On the other hand, how much can we really talk about the church's response? Because I imagine it'll be fairly straightforward.
Mm.
Maybe I'm
Yes
wrong
and no.
on that. You know, like, I feel like we might, like, we can start there, certainly, but like, I feel
Oh,
like
sure, and
if we run out,
if we
Right.
run out, then we can move
Yeah.
on. But I just figured that would be maybe a good initial
Right. No, I
thing
think
instead
for
of
sure.
jumping straight into like, Ethan, you think reparations? I think you're stupid, right? Like we should probably avoid doing
Right.
this to begin with. Just as a thing.
Yep.
Just
No, I think that's
So
a great
anyway,
parameter.
feel free to take it away from there if you want, but
Yeah.
I just thought I'd
Yeah.
throw that as
I think the focus
thing.
more on the personal and like the church relation to it.
Yeah,
would be
I
what-
agree. And I mean, right now, the majority of the debate is centered on Black Lives Matter and kind of African American civil rights. But I think discussion as a whole is around everybody's civil rights, because I think that's we're a melting pot country. So I mean, while that is the dominant discussion right now, I think the idea is for as Christians, all right, like just because I'm African American doesn't mean that I'm necessarily not racist in some shape, form, or fashion. So I don't want to come at this from like hey, I'm this moral
Oh, sure.
high ground person, where like, and because I think that's some of the discussion that I've seen has been more of a people preaching at people, and I think I don't feel like that's the right. Well, I think the accepting of we're all coming at this from different areas and we all have particular bias. And I think the point is for us to recognize that we do have bias and to work towards eliminating that bias. And so, yeah, no, I think the fact that these types of conversations are happening all over the world is really cool, because I think if you look back 50, 100 years ago, it may have been a conversation here or there, but it wasn't on the scale of what it is now. And I think those types of conversations are the good starting place to get things rolling. So yeah, happy to join in and meet everybody.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I guess even one to throw out there from the beginning. And so I think a good way we can just do this is questions that you guys think are good, that the church and individuals we need to be thinking through, that we can just ask the group and everybody can kind of throw their thoughts out there. So if you got one, go for it.
Sure. I mean, it might sound edgy, but so sorry. I'll start us off on an edge. Should the church have any different response toward Black people than white people, or is that inherently having to have a different response rather than just treating the poor as the poor or treating X or Z? Should we not just have the same response toward all people?
So are you asking, should we essentially culturally shape our message?
Yeah, maybe that's a decent point. Or should we be culturally shaping our actions more? Because I think when you're talking about that, it's more.
I mean,
I mean,
either way,
I'm hoping we're not changing the gospel just based off what somebody.
sure,
is.
but sometimes how you a lot of missionaries will say a lot. Sometimes how you present it is culturally dependent, right?
Yeah.
Like, so are we asking, should you do that? Are we asking, should you approach the community in a different manner and offer different things because of what the culture of the community is? What refine your question a little more.
Maybe I'm not understanding, culture, wouldn't you say it's the same culture, American culture? The kind of melting pot, or are there, I mean, and then distinct enclaves within America, yes, but that's true whether you're going into a poor white neighborhood, poor black neighborhood, poor mixed neighborhood.
So
Or,
I guess
you
here's the
know,
thing,
I
would you
mean-
say that a poor inner city neighborhood is the same culture as like a poor rural area?
Probably not.
So then that to me would be my answer to your question is, are they the same?
No, but that doesn't mean it changes the actions you do as a result.
Well,
Is
I
that
can-
true?
I can answer with a bit of a object example.
Sure.
So for context, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Eastern Orthodox. So my church already kind of has a codified worldwide response to this question already in place. So, you know, we've got churches, we've got parishes all across the world that are all united under the same structure, right? So we have, you know, Ethiopian, Russian, Japanese, Korean, right, everywhere. And to answer your question, the message does not change. The way it is presented does. You know, every single country with an Orthodox church uses its native language in the liturgy. It's the same liturgy everywhere. It's the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. We've been using it since the 3rd century AD, but everyone holds it in their native language. Everyone reads the scriptures in their native language. There will be icons, right? So we have depictions of Jesus and the saints in the form of icons that we use in our services. And each race will depict the saints and particularly Jesus to look like them. So if you look at, you know, a European icon, it looks white. If you look at an Ethiopian icon, not only is the art style different, everyone looks black. So, you know, the idea of always enhance the local culture, never erase it. You know, always allow people to have that personalized connection to the faith through their culture that's already there. To answer the question of, do I think that, you know, in the US we have different cultures by race? I would say absolutely. And I would in fact say that that's the real issue, is the different cultures that are clashing, right? Which just so happen to fall along racial lines. Whether that's a causal, you know, if that's a causal thing or not, academic, because they're so closely intertwined, they may as well be the same thing, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, you know, the answer frequently is, you know, the U.S. is a little weird because there's not very many Orthodox Christians in the U.S. So it's sort of a hodgepodge across the country. But, you know, more or less, the way that the American Orthodox Church has solved it is basically by saying you're not American, you're not whatever race you are, you're Orthodox, Christian. And that's your defining thing. And all other like, defining characteristics, while they might be important to you, are secondary. So you're united by being Christian, and you can be different and have different cultures and different expressions within that, but you're all united by this central thing, and that's the central pillar of your identity. And so none of the other divisions actually matter, especially if you're able to, you know, live in different countries, for example. That's, you know, that's the easiest way. And then you can all have your separate cultures. How we would do that here, I'm not sure. You know, maybe, you know, it is already shown, this is just kind of a little tidbit, that the various races already seem to associate more with people of who they perceive to be their own culture, whether that's their own race or not. Some varies on the person. But so we already see this kind of dividing up of the subcultures. And so possibly having a tailored response to each one, right, might be a good idea, because there will be, it's a different environment that you're coming into every time. So like, just that example. I don't know if that helps.
Well, but I still don't necessarily follow that, the actions themselves would, yes, the way you would kind of present an approach might be different, but what you actually, like, the gospel would still be shared the same thing as you pointed out. I would still think that when helping the poor, it's actually not that hard. You're giving food, you're giving supplies, you're being there, you're being a friend, you're being supportive. I mean, like, what in that would have to be different from person to person or culture to culture? Isn't that kind of the same,
Yeah,
just basic
probably
human
nothing.
compassion and
I mean, if
I
you
don't
make
see
it, if
why
you
we
make it general and blanket, right, like, we're gonna help people, or we're gonna have compassion on the people, or we're gonna provide assistance, well, then, yeah, I mean, you say,
I mean,
there's assistance, you could make assistance if you make it that general, right? But different areas may need different assistances,
Okay, that's
If-
depending,
yeah, I
right,
guess
like,
what I would ask is, would you say that, would another way to word your question is, and tell me if this is wrong or not, we shouldn't be looking at someone's race. We should be looking at what they need.
yeah, that's probably a good way to word it.
I think part of what I see though is based upon the experiences that a race may have had, race plays into what they need in the sense that, for instance, here in the US, with those who maybe grew up really feeling hostility against them because of their race, they need like reassurance that they're not, something isn't wrong with them because they are that race, or that they are safe if they're that race, and different things like that. And so some of the things that they might need might not just be specific of taking care, might not be just, when we get into the specifics of how do we help those people, it's going to be things that are directly related to their race. It's not even necessarily just the fact that they're poor, or just because they're uneducated, if that's a thing, if that is what they're going through. I'm just throwing out examples of what could be happening. But race just will play into the practical part of that with some people. With some people it won't. But with some people, the experiences that they've had because they're the race that they are, and because they've been raised in a country that they're the minority, and because people have been racist against them in the past, they have to work through that, where you and I probably don't. And so you and I have not necessarily had anybody be prejudiced against us because we're white. And so we don't have anything like that to work through if I grew up in a poorer community. In similar, as far as what I have as my basic human needs to someone who is Black, if both of us were at the same level education-wise and money-wise and things like that, I wouldn't have any racial things that I need to work through because I didn't have those prejudices against me growing up. Does that make sense?
Yes, in part.
I mean, whether it's even just at even like a counseling level, like you think of somebody who had an experience where, if we go back to the most blatant examples of, lynchings, a Black kid whose brother was lynched because he was Black. Wow, they got a lot of baggage now from that experience that is directly connected to, probably am not comfortable around white people now. I'm probably not like feeling safe because of my skin color. Where a white person maybe had something similar like that, of they had their dad was killed by someone. Still a very violent crime, but it's not linked to their race, because that didn't happen because they were white. It happened because of other reasons. And so we have to help them to work through that in a different way because of that.
though, I mean, the point is, and I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, like, if, say, a white person or a white family was attacked, say, like, you lived in South Africa, right? And then
Right.
that might actually happen because of your race, right? You might actually be attacked. Well, you might have the same problem
Mhm.
right? And so in this instance, yeah, all of that can fit under the blanket, like what you need, right? Your need may or may not be attached, even just on a like psychological, I need to work through this kind of thing to your race or otherwise, right?
Right.
But yeah, if it's like if we're purely focusing on like we're trying to alleviate your economic hardship, well, that might be pretty look really similar across a lot of different people
Yeah.
groups, right? Like just because there are, I mean, economics in a way is economics, right? Like you might say though, like certain approaches to economics work better. You may even say that certain economics approaches to economics work better in different cultures, right? You may say certain ones are pretty cross-cultural. You may say other ones are not, right? That's a bit more politics. I think you could potentially maybe make the argument that economic help that would be pretty similar, but like helping someone say start a business. So like if you say make it under a blanket, like start a business or something, right? Say that's what you're helping with. Okay, well, that may be the same, but what it looks like to start a business in like inner city Harlem may look significantly different than it's like to start a business in the middle of Nowheresville, Minnesota, right? You're still helping them start a business because earning money is earning money in the end of the day, right? Like you relieve economic hardship by, earning money and getting out of economic hardship, right? But exactly how it plays out may be slightly different. The skill set, even under that same banner, may be different, needed, right? Some things will be the same, right? There's obviously like a base in potential, and I think maybe Ethan would agree with this, like a very large base of this is almost all the same, and then it's at the very end, it gets tailored by almost that personal touch to the different places. But yeah, like I would even guess like 95% of like the knowledge will be relatively similar, but it's that personal touch that might make it work or not, right? Might make it stick, might make it seem acceptable, might make it whatever, right? Just as a
Right.
that'd be my
Well, then I can follow a question.
Yep.
Why do it based on groups and not just individuals?
Because you can follow stats with groups. For example,
That's fair.
the fatherlessness rate in the Black community is so astronomically higher than any other group. It might not be a terrible plan to make if you're doing a youth ministry, for example,
Mhm.
a ministry specifically for Black children without fathers. It'd be a huge group, right? And it's not that anyone else is excluded, it's that you are giving a particular demographic with a particular need that follows a specific trend, specific help that they need in that area, right? And that one example people have been talking about for years because the number one predictor of criminality is not having a father in the home. Number one predictor. So, that might explain why crime rates are so much higher among Blacks because that fatherlessness problem, right? So now you've just tackled, you've tackled the politics, you've tackled the religious response, and all just, instead of just trying to say that everyone is the same, when that's clearly not the case, and saying, oh, they're all just individuals, they're all just individuals. No, we have these trends, we have data, why not use it? Just because we're trying to make some kind of statement about how, we don't see race or something like that. It's absurd. If the trends exist, follow them. You don't have to speculate about why they exist. You just have to fix them.
Well, shouldn't you speculate about why they exist?
You can.
So looking at the mass incarceration of African American males, looking at, all right, is there any policy that is maybe creating that? And so the idea of just fixing the problem, so just looking at, all right, let's take care of the kids.
That's fair.
Is there, like, I
I was trying not to get into the weeds.
Yeah,
I tend to agree that we should ask why is it happening,
Yeah, but I
was
think
just trying not
that,
to get in the weeds
I think that
directly.
backing up and taking that full picture and saying, all right, as like, what's the solution? The solution is in part, all right, let's take care of kids. But I think there's another solution to say, all right, where are the fathers going, and is there any way for the church to partner with families to say, all right, how can we keep this nuclear family intact? And then I think, cool, like then that policy of, all right, 4 different segments of the population, is there a segment that, hey, this solution might work better for them? Then I think backing up and looking across the entire event chain, for lack of a better term, then like, yeah, that's exactly what the church looking at a community could say is, hey, like, we have this problem in our neighborhood, in our neighbor's neighborhood, or the next city over. As Christians, what is our duty to either vote for, all right, figuring out what the problem is and voting for policies that will positively impact them, or getting out and going and working ourselves. But I think that's kind of what these discussions are there for, is to say, all right, is there any other way for us to help people that need help as a Christian organization, and looking at the entire problem and seeing if there's anything to be done. Now, there may not be, but I think that full debate will get us where we want to go.
And I mean, I think your point was, and Ethan said he agreed, right, of the why. Where like, say if we thought mass incarceration was the problem, and we thought it was, and then we would go, okay, well, we would have, in a way, we would have to be asking why, right? Like that's a very immediate, like, well, I can't, there's not much I can seem to directly personally do about it, right? So I have to even just ask why, just because it seems more like a policy thing. For like, say, youth group, right? You might go, okay, fatherlessness is an issue. Let's offer some sort of support to this demographic. And then you'd have to ask, what kind of support, right? Like what seems like it would be, what seems like it would be most helpful to this demographic to overcome the challenge that we're specifically bringing them in for, right? But that would be the next step after, like,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know,
if I-
like,
if I
let's
had
do a
to-
youth group, but then you'd obviously have to come up with, what are you
I'd
doing?
have to,
Yeah.
to keep going with the example, I would have to just say like, have some kind of Godfather program. Right?
That'd be interesting.
Just have, because, you know, it's, once again, Orthodox Church, we've always had godparents, sort of your spare set in case your parents die.
Yeah.
Yeah. To put it coarsely. But, and there's a lot else wrapped up in that. But, you know, so you can just say, you know, have maybe like an assigned of people, you know, get together and then have kids choose their godfather from adults that they trust.
But what if there are
Or
no
the
adults?
mother, yeah, I mean,
What if there are no adults to trust?
would,
You have more.
give me, yeah, I'd say you have a bigger problem there.
Yeah.
What do
And
you
so I
mean,
think
what are
that's
you
where-
diving into? Like,
That's
what
where
are
the
you
church
trying to-
comes in from we're getting the policy to say, all right, what can we do? So if the problem is there aren't fathers in the home, and if we look at other communities where there are fathers in the home, if we get fathers back in the home, does that then start to?
Yeah, Ethan was offering like, what could a church response be
Yeah,
to
and
that
so
problem,
I'm saying
right?
the church response is, all right, why are there not fathers in the home? And they're doing an analysis of, all right, is there an unjust law? Is there looking at policing practices? Is there any way to increase to, like, why are people breaking the law? And is there a role for the church to keep people from breaking the law? And saying, okay, because that would get things moving and would solve the problem of, all right, the problem is parents aren't in the home. As a church, and maybe I should put that as a question, is that the role of the church to say, hey, there aren't fathers in the home. Is there anything that we can do as Christians to help move that? And that being mentorship to preteens and young men. Is it looking at, hey, what are we voting on? What's our county commissioner doing? What are our judges doing? Are there any unjust laws on our books?
Right.
Is that within our scope as Christians to say, hey, here's what we need to be doing?
Yeah.
Yeah, and asking that question and saying, yeah, should we be doing that?
So
I mean,
this is obviously like starting to hit on one of the topics that I want to make sure we talk about. And there's a weird balance of this that like we want to talk about the issues that are going on that probably need a political fix. And I want to be able to express and talk about those openly so we all like understand it. And I think some of us might not even know and understand some of those things. And so to be able to talk, hey, here's the issue, but maybe we don't get into because that's starting to jump into the politics of this is how it needs to be solved.
Yeah.
So I think what you're hinting at in a lot of ways in this is issues of what a lot of times is defined as systemic racism. And so I want like, we'll discuss this a little bit of what that means, whether, you know, there's even debate of whether that exists or not. But I know in the past, Jason and I, like one of the examples that you gave me that I think was super helpful for me to understand is systemic racism. Sometimes I think we can really respond to that because it sounds as if there's like policies that are being made that are systematically, purposely made to be racist. And though I think there definitely has been some policies like that in the past, especially before the 13th Amendment, we would say that a lot of policies that exist, maybe even now or in recent years, have had results that end up hurting a specific minority population or a specific race of people, and therefore had racist consequences. But those policies weren't necessarily put in place for the purpose of creating those sort of injustices to those groups. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. That's probably even getting into the question of politics as well. But I think, so the example that you've shared with me is when we've talked about crack cocaine, just crack cocaine versus normal cocaine. That is something that like when the war on drugs was kind of declared, you had a lockdown of we are going to lock down crack cocaine especially and put a policy that I think was like 10-year penalty for if you had it or something very extreme like that. And so what that ended up doing is crack cocaine was generally the drug of the streets versus cocaine, which is the more of the drug of the penthouse suites. And so you have then the inner city poor that are the people that are using crack cocaine, which then ended up in itself like meant a lot of that was a Black population. And when they were caught with it or dealing it, they were put in jail for 10 years. Now you've taken the father out of the house. And that's resulting in some of those issues that we're talking about of the problem of not having a father in the home. And then, you know, you have one household or one person income because now the mom's working. Maybe some of the kids are needing to work, so they're dropping out of school, or they're just stressed because dad's not around, so they're not doing well in school. And so that creates this kind of whirlwind where then those kids grow up and they never got a formal education. And so now what do when they grow up? Well, they go and they do crack cocaine again. And so that creates this issue that the system has created, whether they meant it in a racial way or not. That's a problem. And so that's one of the things I think we need to just be aware of as Christians and be thinking about in political terms of, all right, well, when I'm looking at who I'm voting for, what policies I'm voting for, we're looking at how do those policies, how do those people understand and see the effects of something like that? that maybe wasn't even designed. I don't know if the people who designed some of like those laws around cocaine, I don't think necessarily they probably had the intention of this is really going to hurt the Black community. Let's pass this law, but it did. And so those are some of the things that we need to talk about. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's especially around just looking at laws. The recent events have really challenged me to almost go back and look at history and understand, all right, how did we get to here? And man, it's some stuff has been, you could say, it's pretty sinister, and other stuff has been, all right, we passed this law, it hurts these people, it doesn't hurt, like every law hurts some and may not hurt others. And so I think that like as we're having this conversation, I think the idea that when a law gets passed, there are winners and losers. And I think as Christians, as we're looking at voting and doing different things, I like until recently I wouldn't have put those two together. But I think there is some responsibility for us to say, all right, does this person, not necessarily are they the champion of my moral code, but I think that question might need to be in the full portfolio of things that you think about. And so looking at different laws and saying, all right, if there's an unjust law, if there's a unjust policy, be it for schools, police, hospitals, any of that, and we're aware of it, how much should we do, can we do? Because the other side is the cycles for change for those only comes up when there's an election. So there's a decoupling of, all right, it's easier to go, we can go and volunteer and do something right now, but those big changes happen every 2, 4, 6 years. And so it really does bring into question, like how much should we look at politicians and look at that as Christians versus go out and be the change that you want to see. So like, don't just write a letter to your senator, like go out and help somebody, which like your policy would do that. So that's kind of what I've wrestled with here recently is what is the balance of, I'm
Well,
interested to see what you guys thought.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that, well, I mean, I definitely think we should be looking at macro and micro at the same time, right? You need both. But more specifically, I mean, okay, if we're going to talk about like if we want to dive into like the legal, the law enforcement, criminal justice stuff, that is my area of expertise.
Okay.
If you guys
Yeah.
want, I can talk about this. I'll keep it brief, but I can
Yeah,
pretty
no, that'd be
detailed.
I have
Okay.
one question first. You mentioned hospitals on your list, police, schools, hospitals. I've never heard any hospital stuff, so
Yeah.
I've just totally missed this. If this is
Yeah, and so I think there is there's anywhere where people are working, there's bias, and so I'm not saying that there are people who are actively saying, "Hey, I'm going to kill that person," but I think be it cultural differences, you can look at immigrant people, like people coming in and not understanding the culture. There can be a language barrier. And so there are things where, all right, if we look at our healthcare system, are we doing things in a way that minimizes harm to people? It's more of that. Are we doing things the best way that we can do them, or do people fall through the cracks? And answering like, is there another way? And so it's more of a looking at the policy and seeing, does it do unintended harm to anybody? And not necessarily for a malicious reason where some administrator is saying, those people are from this country, they don't even care. But I think the issue of, as we're talking about racism, is more of a bias issue, either conscious or unconscious. And so everywhere that people are interacting, there's an opportunity for that conscious and unconscious bias. And so the big places where that can come up, law enforcement, education, and healthcare.
well, I guess what I'm just asking about healthcare is like in education, you hear the stats about black schools, black communities, the education there. You hear in police brutality, you hear all the different cases and the stories that come up. I haven't heard anything related to that with healthcare, so I was curious if, and you don't have to know the numbers,
Yeah.
but just like, what are the things that are out there?
There, so, and
Because that's
Don't
just,
quote me on
that's
that.
just
So
a
it's-
totally new, like, I've
so
never
there,
heard
oh
any
man,
claims
I
on
don't,
that.
Is it just the different health outcomes?
yeah, there are different health
Yeah.
outcomes for different ethnicities, different races, across people. And then the question is why? And so it's not a situation where the protests might be a little bit more in your face for law enforcement. Whereas that's, but I think there is a question, and the question is, all right, as a country with our resources, can we do better? And so the healthcare doesn't get as much play, but it is kind of in that umbrella of things that no matter who you are, you at some point rely on all three of those for law enforcement to create a safe environment where you can go to work and go get your groceries and take your kids for a walk and go to a park. Education to get educated, that system, and healthcare because everybody at some point.
As far as I know, the short version is different races are hit hard by different diseases, and different cures work better for different races. And the controversy is, you know, that there has sort of been a stigma on trying to research racially tailored cures to diseases because it's like, oh, well, you know, you can't just give someone a different medicine just because they're black. Well, if it works better, shouldn't we? And so there's ever since the 50s, that's been a big controversy.
I've never heard of that one before.
Yeah,
so
it's
that's
pretty
not-
obscure.
And I'd say it probably also goes into, depending on what health outcomes, right? Health outcomes are notoriously tricky, right? Because you have the background health of the person
Right.
in general, and you have to go, okay, well, you have to then go, okay, well, can you tie it to class, right? Like, do rich people have better health outcomes? And if they do, is it because they got better treatment, or is it because they had a healthier lifestyle to begin with, right? Can it tie to lifestyle in general beforehand, and is that tied to class? Because sometimes you go to a grocery store, you find eating healthy sometimes really expensive, right?
I actually heard of a sort of specific example about this one, about how the black community had a higher rate of, like, I don't know if it was specifically miscarriages, but dangerous things in pregnancy.
Yeah.
And someone looking at that also noticed that that might have to do with the fact that the rate of obesity is also higher in the African American community. It's because it's the same complications as what they were finding for that.
So that would be
Things like that being in healthcare too, do you count that as a racism thing or a class thing?
so it get real complicated with health.
Which,
I've just never heard.
Yeah,
of,
it's not
like,
my.
claims or people who are
Oh, the other-
specifically really out there against the health.
Oh, sure. I mean, but you'll
That's
also
what I'm
never
just
hear
curious.
that like, none of the health stuff is almost ever studied in women because women have cycles and that's challenging for research, so people don't want to do it. So
Don't blame them.
just
I've
as,
done research
that's another
before,
thing
it's
you'll
annoying.
find is most
Probably
research
should
is
do
good,
it, but I
like,
don't blame them.
yeah, so.
so there's something else that I was sort of like, one of the things you mentioned is looking at.
Well, he was gonna throw out some stuff
Yeah.
regarding police stuff.
Yeah,
And
okay,
then we'll
so
come to
law
you.
enforcement. So we have to go way back to the 50s. So you have the passage of the Civil Rights Amendments, the Civil Rights Acts, you have integration, right, segregation's wrecked the whole civil rights movement, and so that's all over, that's all ended, it's been done, right? You know, so there's this kind of, you know, okay, we've done, you know, what we can, and now we just have to work towards things going forward. That was sort of that's the atmosphere, that's the mood that we're in, right? Post civil rights, everyone's on the racism is bad train unless you live in Alabama, right? You know, you're just so that's sort of the national mood. I'm just trying to set the tone.
Okay.
So then you have welfare, right? Is still carried over from the post-war and from the New Deal, right? From FDR, and so they're trying to expand welfare and change the parameters under it. And one of the things is you get more welfare for your kids if you're a single parent. Now, prior to that happening, I believe it was 90% of blacks had a full nuclear family, mother and father. That welfare thing has changed within a decade. That's halved. And now we're at the point of 90% single parent households. Right?
Because of the welfare benefit.
Because of the welfare benefit, right?
Is-
People weren't getting married, they were having more children out of wedlock in order to get welfare.
Well, he's at least one of the contributing
Yeah,
factors.
it was- it
Because we've
was-
seen it, those statistics for
Right.
single parent household is going up for both black and white.
It's going up
communities, for
across the
sure.
board.
Yep.
And both of those trends start at that welfare program.
Hmm.
Both of them start going up there. That's where, so if you see, that's where, if you have this as the rate, that's where it starts to go down.
Okay.
Right there. Then you do have so that then led to higher dependence on welfare and more drug use among all poor communities, right? So now, you have whites doing heroin, blacks doing crack cocaine. I don't know what the Hispanic drug was back then. I haven't looked into it that deep. But, you do have the 80s war on crime, Ronald Reagan. And the crack versus regular cocaine thing was less of, just a side note, was less of a overall thing. It was more the feds went after cocaine because they went straight to the supplier. Whereas crack, since it was so much broader on the streets, he left to local police departments. Because in Reagan's mind, a user, a dealer, right, someone barely involved in the process, they're all the same. And we have to criminalize them all the same because it's, just say no. It's the Reagan, I can bash Reagan forever, but we got to move on. Right, so that was sort of the idea, and that carried through, and that made it worse because then you have, and that's what started to drive poverty down because you can't have welfare if you're on drugs, or in some places, right? Like they started asking that question on welfare. So now you have people who have been depending on welfare for their income lose welfare and revert to crime, right? And so you have rising fatherlessness and rising income problems. And so that's where you really see the big spike in crime. That's where 1986 had the highest crime of the 20th and 21st centuries. Like it's been going down since then. I think there's been actually a slight spike in recent years, but up until like 2016, it was a straight down curve.
Yeah, because the opioid problem.
It's not even the opioid problem.
Recently.
That's not even
Really?
what the spike in crime is. No, that's been
Oh, not the spike in crime, sorry. That would be the spike in drug use and suicides. My bad.
right. Yeah.
Wrong.
So yeah, they're actually
Wrong correlation.
but yeah, so you see that. So if you see welfare as being the key, like hinge point, not necessarily any of the laws, because all the laws came after and were treating the symptoms of that welfare problem, right, rather than treating the welfare. So, in my opinion, when we look back at criminality rates, we have to look first at that genesis point, or else we'll be treating symptoms and never the actual problem.
Okay.
So that's one part. Then the second part, you mentioned systemic racism, right, which is the idea that people get harsher sentences or are arrested more just for being black.
No,
No,
nope,
that's not what you mean.
nope.
Do you
I
mean laws?
So-
You've helped me understand this best, so
So,
I even turn it to
Lots
you.
of people mean different things. So what
Yes.
if you're
We-
asking
this
what
is
does
the way.
Jordan
This is
mean?
the way we,
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. please
Jason.
define
Yeah,
it.
Jason and I. This is the way we see it.
Sweet.
So a law negatively impacts a group of people, black, white, man, male, female, trans, like whoever. It impacts them more negatively than other groups.
Okay.
And so the systemic piece of it is that this law is, hey, this is a law for everybody. But for whatever reason, it may have an unintended consequence of harming this group of people. And so the question is, all right, as a society, is it possible for us to understand that that's possible and write better laws? To have law be equally adjudicated, for lack of a better, or across all people. So like the idea would be an improvement on the war on drugs would be kind of what we're doing with opioids right now, where it's less criminality and it's more how can we get these people treatment? These people are sick, they have opioid addiction. How can we get them treatment rather than putting them in prison?
I would argue that's not a race issue though.
Well, but
Even if it affects one race, like I'm not sure I quite understand.
It's
that
not
definition.
racist in the sense that it's intended to be racist. It's intended to hurt a group of people, but the
Right, I know,
consequences
yeah, I get
end
that.
up hurting more of a race than others.
So
And
then-
so that's what,
If we're talking about a law, if
right.
you think something should be illegal, and one group commits that illegal act more often than everyone else,
Oh.
is there anything you can do about that?
Yeah,
Should you
well,
do something
and so
about it?
like
at that point, like, are you sure you want to make it illegal if that's your?
Well,
your
the
make or
issue is
break?
not the legality, it's how the law is executed. And so the argument is that this group of people is negatively impacted way more than anybody else. So you look at sentencing, you look at,
Okay, yeah.
and so it's
So
and
sentencing
taking
control
out of
practices.
like there's a boogeyman kind of thing, because
No,
I think
I
that
agree.
gets put in there where it's like there's a boogeyman out, and it's like no, but the idea is that as a country as great as ours, can we do better?
Okay.
Creating laws, and can we do better at enforcing those laws where a group of people is just not devastated, while that same devastation isn't seen across other groups.
I
So
guess the
you're
question-
talking about enforcement and sentencing practices mostly, which may or may not be intentional, or
Um,
you're assuming that are not intentional.
Yeah, and
Okay.
just the question of, all right, is this law just? And just being super, is it perfect? And it's not going to be perfect, but to say, all right, do we have laws that negatively impact people? That, all right, if the law was just, it would not hit, like they could be penalized, but it wouldn't be 10 years. So like you, and,
Right,
and,
okay.
and, the-
So
yeah,
I actually do have an answer for that though,
okay.
because that this is where I was originally going to go. I think I
Two
just
questions.
worded it wrong.
Why don't we let Ethan
Yeah.
make his point and then we can ask
So-
questions.
There are two things that often get brought up when I hear this question. So I'm just going to answer these 2 points, whether or not they're your points or not. So there's the frequency of police patrol,
Mhm.
right? Random police patrol, and harshness of sentencing varying by race, because it does. So I'll start with the sentencing one first, because that's the one that's really easy to nail down. So you see the same trend. So for the same crime, a black man and a white man, the black man will receive the harsher sentence. It's a trend. It's not a massive trend. I think the rate is like 60% of the time.
Okay.
The same thing happens with male and female, regardless of race. Even if it's a black woman and a white man, the woman will get the lighter sentence. That's as much as 70% of the time. Right? And the reason isn't because of a bias against any given person or because of any law or regulations input or policy or anything else. All it is simple heuristics. And it is a bias that people have.
Heuristics, is that what you said?
Heuristics.
What do you
It's-
mean by
It's
that?
the human error, and I'll
Okay.
explain. So
Like
you're a
judges.
judge, right? You hand out sentences, and 90% of the people you see for repeat crimes are black men or are men, right? We'll just go with men, right? Rather than women. 90% of the people you bring in for aggravated drunken assault are men, because women don't do that as much, right? And so you start to see just the same men over, and you go, oh, another dude hit someone in the bar. You know what? Fuck it. I'm just gonna give you a harsher sentence, right? Because I'm tired of seeing you up here.
Mhm.
You see a woman, it throws you for a loop. You just go back to the statute, right? You start following the statute more closely and more closely to the minimum rather than the maximum. Instead of going, oh, another dude, another degenerate on the street, just punching random people at the bar, right? Give him closer to the maximum sentence because you always see men. And so it's not a conscious thing that happens to people. No one would ever admit to it. No one could have. You couldn't like. the question becomes, can you really administrate that if we want judges to have actual like discretion in these cases? But that is, if you account for all the other variables, I had a professor who ran the regressions on this. He accounted for all the other variables, and it was just the judge involved. If the judge saw more of a certain demographic, he gave them a harsher sentence, or she, every time, regardless of what that demographic difference was. So if we're looking at, well, what's the systemic racism? Well, there it is, right there. It's a bias. It's an unconscious bias.
Mhm.
But the question is, can you fix it if you want judges to have actual discretion? Can you fix it? I honestly don't know if we have a ready-made solution for it.
Are people
Other
scared
than
of computers?
Oh, and then, the computer thing gets even worse.
computers are even more racist than people.
Yeah.
Say why?
Yeah,
Because
because they also follow the
Yeah.
same trends.
So if you
No,
look
no, no,
at,
but if you just program.
This is his field of expertise.
so
like, in
computers
his
are
own
even
job,
worse
so definitely.
because you look at like zip code. So one of the things that might go into if you get parole is, hey, what zip code are you moving back to? If you move back to a zip code where everybody gets arrested, then you get dinged. And so it's easier to build in bias, and it's also harder to pull bias out of an algorithm. But in all of that, the idea is, all right, for us to push to say if Lady Liberty is blind, she has a blindfold and she has the scales. And so the idea is, how can we as Christians push our legal system to be that blind as close as it can be system where, all right, if you're a dude and it's after lunch, and it's right before lunch, you don't get 3 extra years versus the guy who did the exact same thing and it's after lunch. And recognizing that there's like, we're using human judges and in some cases algorithms, and there are limitations to that. But how can we kind of through conversations like this say, all right, how can we push people to do better, to get to that ideal of, all right, the legal system in this country is blind.
Can we
So,
literally
so
just do
far, what I've heard, at least from Ethan's perspective, is we just need everyone to commit crimes at the same rate, and then
More or less.
we'll get correctly equal.
But yeah, like I think that's like, yeah, no, and I love the stats of like, all right, here's, and the breaking down of going a couple levels deeper of like, all right, here's what's really going on. Because I think when we get to that, those types of like, when we get to that data, then these discussions turn into, all right, the discussion is not how do we get this boogeyman who's getting brown and yellow people and putting them in jail, but how do we create a system where, all right, we have limitations, we have human judges, how do we help them out? We have human police officers who are doing a great job going out and catching bad guys and pulling like the worst of the worst off the street, but that's a freaking hard job. How do we help that?
I'll also point out that this trend
Mhm.
Also accounts for the demographic of the judge.
Okay.
So a black judge still gives harsher sentences.
Yeah, and so like the racism thing is like, and that's the other thing that in the last couple of months, racism has always, I get the feeling that it's a white person is racist against a brown, red, or yellow person. Racism is on both sides. So like, black people need to have the same conversation. Japanese, Asian people need to have the same conversation as everybody's having. Like, we just happen to have this demographic here. The same thing needs to happen in predominantly black neighborhoods, predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, because like there's a saying, everybody has another name for everybody else. Like racism isn't a, racism isn't a one person type of thing where it's like, all right, everybody needs to have these conversations. And so like a black judge saying, well, hey, white kid, I know you've had a great life and you've been living in Fort Collins. Here's 17 years. Like, no, like that should have been way less. Like that shouldn't happen either.
Yeah.
Hey, black cop who pulls over Hispanic guy. Hey, you had your music too loud. Let's go down the precinct. Actually, should have given you a warning. Like, go home, kid. Like, turn your music down. Like that should be. Everybody should be the same.
Liam, why don't you go first?
So, for one of the things that we mentioned a few times is the different outcomes being racist. And I think, because I think it's important to note that that sounds different from the way like traditional racism would be defined, where it's about intent. And that difference, I think, is really important for when you're going to actually call something racist. Because it means that, like when we're talking about the laws that have different outcomes, we mentioned every law is going to have different outcomes. Is it really bad if they have different outcomes, even along racial lines? Well, like, we don't want them to have those outcomes along racial lines. But it, well, like,
Does that mean?
Yeah,
so, like, does that make it the
There-
law actually racist for
Right.
it to have?
Or unjust.
Yeah,
In that,
racist or
in that
unjust.
sense, right? Because
Yeah,
saying something's racist holds a heavy moral connotation
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
injustice, right?
I'm pulling the moral out of it and saying racist if you substitute a word for biased as, and why it's biased, if it's because you just hate people or because you unintentionally harm these people, the outcome is the same. Somebody is harmed. Why somebody's harmed is important, and we need to address that, but I feel like
Sure, and
We have a
before we
couple
move on
different
to you, Katie, I'll go back to Ethan was kind of making the point earlier, where it was like, well, say we, like, for drugs, right? Like, we'll just say it, right? Well, okay, we don't want people doing drugs, right? And so we're like, okay, drugs are illegal. So i.e. we're trying to dissuade people from doing it. And I mean, this super classic example, right? And this particular group of people happens to do more drugs, and therefore they get incarcerated more for it, right? At that point, do you go, you might go, okay, we don't want that to happen for X, Y, and Z reason, but do you really go, the law was bad because it happened to incarcerate this group of people more? Because it did exactly what you intended it to do. It incarcerated people who did drugs more often, right? You may go, well, that's problematic. And you might go, okay, well, it's incarcerating, say, this group of people more, and that's problematic because but the actual problem is, why is this group of people doing drugs more often? And then you have these other issues that you're actually
More the point
concerned
that I was
with.
trying to make there is,
but-
if we have a problem where we're saying, well, hang on, that's a bridge too far. You've just destroyed, this community over a substance.
Mhm.
My question is not, what color skin are they? My question is, are you sure you want to ban that substance? Right? That's my question, is
Yeah.
how, if that disparity,
Mhm.
right, can make you go, hang on, and makes you feel nervous about it, maybe you don't actually care that much about actually making that thing illegal.
Right.
And if it's not that important for it to be illegal to where you don't care who's doing it, get them out.
Right.
Then don't make the law.
Sure.
Or,
But
or
that's
the way
that's
that,
just the corollary of
Right.
what I was saying,
Yeah,
right? Because
no,
you
yeah.
might take the opposite position and go like, gosh darn it, no, this drug should, or this substance should be completely illegal, and I don't care who
Right.
is in possession of it, they should go to jail. And it just so happens that this community gets really hit hard by it.
Right.
Right.
But I think some of the question is also, is the enforcement of that law the most effective way to actually get that drug away from the area?
Sure, and that
So-
would be
so for
another
instance, yes.
question, right?
So for instance,
is
we
an
talk
issue.
about
Yes,
this,
it is.
like, okay, is it actually most effective to get rid of crack cocaine on the streets by giving somebody a 10-year sentence in jail, who then's going to come out and the only thing they still know is how to deal with drugs? Or would it be better to put them in a program, get them not addicted to that anymore, and teach them a skill that now when they leave, they can have a job that they don't have to rely on dealing drugs anymore? That will actually probably do more to actually get that drug off the streets than actually the 10-year sentence.
Sure.
And that's part of, I think, the question in all of this too.
Yeah.
As far
Yeah, I
as,
mean-
especially when we're dealing with the politics and policies of all of it. So, Katie?
Yeah, so a few questions. One is, why can't we just put people in black boxes, eliminate their race and their gender from the judge's thing, and give them voice disguisers? And
That
they can
costs a
still
lot of
explain-
money.
And
And also
actually,
because-
you literally use a sheet and a weird
Well-
microphone with.
Also because identity is a major point of evidence. So
Yeah, but we
if you
can
have
still-
eyewitnesses who describe a suspect, you have to be able to see their face for that witness, for that.
Yeah,
Can't you just
have
have
you
the
ever been on a
eyewitness say-
jury?
A few times. Well, I was nearly on one once.
Okay, so you have not been on a jury.
No.
Okay, well, when you're
I've
on a
been called in
jury,
twice. I was
Wait,
on one.
yeah,
once.
so when you're on a jury, right, you obviously you're just sitting there listening to a bunch of witnesses talk about whoever the suspect is, right? So
Yeah, but
if
your
someone was
example
describing
more
someone
just
else-
A single judge who sees multiple people. I was assuming that's not, jury trials are a little bit different. for
No,
you
no,
different
okay, so
crimes.
every trial has a jury and a judge.
Yeah.
The jury
Well,
determines
not-
guilt,
No, because civil trials don't.
but this is
Every
criminal.
criminal trial does.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is-
and
is
that's just-
cocaine and drug use considered criminal?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
It-
definitely.
it's only
If you
civil
get
if
large
you
amounts
are,
of jail time, it's a criminal.
so
trial.
criminal is state versus defendant, right? Civil is me versus you, and the state is arbitrating.
That's right.
So if the state is bringing an accusation against you, it is always criminal.
Okay, so it's not just the judge, it's also the jury. This, that you're.
No,
finding crime
so
occurs. Because the jury
A
is.
jury finds guilt. A judge determines sentence based on the laws and ordinances given to him.
So yeah, why can't you still just blindfold the judge?
Because the judge needs to determine admissibility of evidence.
There's a lot of legal.
You can't
Yeah.
just trust
So-
this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of legal
It's
complications.
a
have
very
to, like,
long
Make it.
You can't
conversation
have
just
put
to
one
deal with that.
intermediator in who
No.
like tells the judge, yeah, this guy's not like this guy's described.
Oh, and I think
You
some
can't
of
be
it
that bad.
is
I honestly think you could figure
the
out a way.
benefit of a judge looking at a kid who just did some stuff and being able to
To have
have that
human
interpersonal to say, all right, because the other side is like, all right, sometimes the sentence is reduced because the judge can see.
But isn't it supposed to be blind? Wasn't that the goal?
Yeah,
Just
that is
to
the
be
goal. So
blind,
it is
shouldn't be
a-
reduced or
But there's
But
something to
also-
be said for,
Being
and I
able
think
to-
we would all think it's a good thing
And
when a
it's-
judge is able to look at you and be like, Alan, you screwed up, but I can tell you know it, and you're not gonna do this again.
I don't know, I
verse,
would say that's
hey,
something.
You screwed up, and you probably need to get a little kick in the pants to really understand what you did.
But that's not blind justice. So is that just?
Uh,
I mean, that seems like you're kind of just throwing this human emotion factor into it that,
So would they
Is
ever
it-
go like below so like say they had a general range in the ordinance for what this crime,
they usually.
Warranted,
some of them
right?
do, yeah.
Mhm.
would they ever go below that?
No,
See, so
not where it's mandated, and they will also not go above the maximum.
yeah,
See, why not
but they
just
may be
solid
more
number?
likely to give you the minimum if they see you're penitent, right?
Yes.
I
That-
think
So,
you should
but that's
have a
still
solid
within-
number, though.
But that's still within it's still within the law.
A judge's options, a judge has 4 options.
Okay.
Give you the maximum,
So you-
give you the minimum,
Okay.
pick something in between,
Okay.
dismiss the case.
Got it.
That's it.
Okay.
That's what the judge does.
Why can't
And
the
in
judge just
between
choose between dismiss
sentencing and
do it?
accusing, the judge also handles bail, and handles, it arbitrates, the debate between lawyers, between cases.
Yeah, why can't you just choose between dismiss it or do it?
Might be along
Like,
the
why
lines
should there
of,
be a maximum minimum range thing anyway? Why shouldn't a
Because
single
then
crime
That
be a
is an
single-
entire different conversation.
Would
I've
like-
literally done
Are there
entire
some people
semesters.
on my side here?
would like a quick thing be, you want
Isn't
a
that
different
against-
punishment
Isn't
for a
there
person who
anyone
shoplifts one time versus and is repentant
Well,
about it,
then,
versus a person who's been shoplifting for years, keeps getting caught.
that's
going in and
also-
Those different
um,
penalties for.
yeah, there's different
second
penalties
crimes.
for various things, and then you get into, really, really stupid things like what California does, which is the 3 strikes law, which, we can, get rid of that, because that's definitely, get rid of that now. I don't care who it affects, because it hurts everybody,
What is that? I don't
3
think I-
strikes law,
Yeah.
where 3 felonies, you're away for life.
Yeah, and it doesn't
Yeah,
matter. what
and it doesn't matter what the felony
Yeah, because
is.
those are felonies, not that.
It
extreme.
can be a low bar
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, it seems a little. I see. All right,
That's really stupid.
it's good to know.
Colorado used to have one, and then we got rid of it because we realized.
Did you have another?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
related to, with what Alan said about the disparate effects. If it's, really just that we're, looking at for, that, there was something, I forgot it.
Okay.
Come back to me.
One that I'd like to throw out to you, Jason, is what, obviously we're a group that's wanting to have these discussions. When you think of wanting to give people advice of like how to talk about this stuff, how to learn and grow more in learning about these issues, what's advice that you recommend people kind of?
So like this has really been challenging for me as well, because it's like, yeah, like what have I done differently? And I've really been pushed to myself and by friends to say like, hey, do something different. And so for me, it's been just understanding history. And so history can be history of our country, history in the Bible, of just how there have been conflicts between people, and saying, all right, in the Bible, what is, as a Christian, what's our ideal? And so then everything else flows from that. And so saying, all right, any law that's unjust, our goal is to be a nation of just laws. Now, all right, will we get there? Who knows? But the idea is, all right, if we can do better, how can we do better? And understanding the data and taking the time to go through and not just take that first soundbite that you get from the news and saying, hey, this sucks for us. All right, cool. Let's get in and understand why. And then the idea is, all right, how do we make things better? Everybody will have a different idea about what that looks like. But then understanding that like everybody's a little bit biased. And so, and you're more biased to, all right, you can walk into a room and say, hey, these are people that I'd be friends with. Hey, these are people that I don't hate them, but we're probably not gonna hang out. Either way, but understanding that, all right, you do have that bias, and then working to alleviate that, where people aren't treated differently because of that. And so for me, that's been one, learning history, two, reading, and even like looking at books and podcasts from just a wide range of people. And so you could easily go across race, but for me, I had a bunch of guys on a podcast, so I need to get some ladies in there. Like getting a diverse view of things, and even trying to listen to things I don't agree with, and seeking that out, have been things that I've done the last couple of months to say, all right, how can I do things where they are different for me, and then I think a lot of prayer and actually like thinking through like, hey, God, show me where I am biased against other deals, and help me understand what's going on, and give me strength to do that, and understand the praying for, all right, what is justice? Hey, there's somebody running for this office. Is it my job to vote for this person or this person, or is it my job to go and help somebody? Probably a little bit of both, but I think all of those things together are things that I've started to do myself. And then from a cautionary standpoint, as I've looked at the news, anything that's heaping guilt, I see a lot of folks heaping guilt on people and saying, hey, you have this and we don't, so you're a bad person. From a Christian standpoint, that's where I stop and say, there's a difference between conviction and saying, hey, brother, here's what I'm seeing. Can we work together? Versus you're a bad person and I'm just going to berate you. So anything that's heaping guilt, that's where I really change the channel and say, cool, I get the idea, but all right, let's talk about this in a different way and say, how can we together work and help each other and help other folks? Because, I mean, right now it's more black-white relations, and that's, as African Americans are the biggest minority, but there are a lot of minorities in this country that we're not talking about. So immigrant, different religions, religious minorities, there are lots of different minority groups that the same conversation everybody can have. And so it's been kind of the history for our country that as African-American civil rights move, then you get civil rights bills, and then small minorities can also benefit. So it's, well, the conversation right now is black, white. I think as Christians, hey, looking for all minorities, because you mentioned like, all right, here in Fort Collins, you don't see as big of a African-American population. So, all right, what do we do here? Well, I mean, I think the goal should be to serve wherever you are and wherever you're called. And so being prayerful about that and saying, what should I do? Is it good? All right, what do I do tomorrow? Kind of thing.
One question I just wanted to throw out there of something that I've seen or I heard about recently, and I'm trying to understand it. So anybody's welcome to throw it out there to give their thoughts. Is one, what I've heard, I haven't looked at the statistics completely, but there is within like, Black community that is low income, say Harlem or whatever, the amount of those people that move out of that sort of low income housing and kind of become a success in the sense that they're probably not relying upon government housing and things like that, is significantly lower for someone who is born into the United States in a low income household and is Black than a Black immigrant who comes to the US and might even move into Harlem and is still in the same, so then has the same prejudices against them as far as getting a job or being dependent on the government and everything else. They're Black, so it's not they're dealing with different levels of racism, but those immigrants have a much higher success rate of getting out and kind of becoming a success. What are you guys' thoughts on what is the reason for that?
Doesn't education have a factor?
I think it might have some, but I think the big one is, at least from most of what I listen to, and I spend too much of my time listening to politics on some of this, it has to do with a cultural thing. So a lot of, particularly with immigrants, they tend to have a higher work ethics than is normal for Americans in general. And you actually see this cross-racially, like Scandinavians, when they move to America, they also do better than
White
anyone
Americans?
else because the Scandinavians have a
I feel
really, really high
like
work
saying
ethic.
cultural is a bit of a misnomer because I would say it's less cultural and more generational, right? And generational and who has decided to make the change and where have you decided to make that change and how big of a change have you decided to make, right? So if you're someone who your parents and your grandparents were both poor living in the United States and your ass is still poor living in the United States, you haven't decided to change your situation. You're poor living in a different country and you say, I could be less poor in the United States. And so you move to the United States. You've already committed to making that change.
That's a good point.
Right? So you land on, and now, so, moving, you've already taken the first step in your, the journey of 1,000 steps begins with a single, whatever.
Journey of 1,000 miles begins with a
Whatever.
step. There you go.
Good enough. Good enough for government work. They've already taken that first step.
Yeah.
And there's already no turning back. Whereas someone who's just grown up and is not even willing to move, cities to improve their situation.
Yeah.
How much less are they going to try to get themselves out in their current city or anything else like that?
Yeah,
So
somebody who immigrates to the U.S. is already willing to take risks to be a
Inertia.
success.
Yeah, I'd say
Inertia.
because it's like if you grew up in Fort Collins, parents are here,
What you trying to say, Jason?
Well, I'm just saying,
I'm
like,
just joking.
oh no, like I'm saying, a couple hundred.
You haven't
folks
gone
who-
anywhere.
But in terms of, all right, you could move.
Yeah.
But it'd be harder than me. I've been here for a year, so it's a little bit harder. But for somebody who came across the country, I don't know anybody here, cool, you don't have roots down.
Right.
And so it's easier for you to say, what's the difference between Denver and Omaha, Nebraska?
Right.
If you're from the other side of the planet, it's
Mhm.
like, it's just that much on the map. Okay, like it's all America, so you may not even notice those cultural differences. Whereas if we moved to Omaha, we'd be like, oh my gosh, this is. Or even just coming from Dallas, like Dallas to here, is not like, oh my gosh, this is such a different place. Whereas if somebody came from another country, they might say, cool,
Y'all eat
everybody's-
hamburgers.
Yeah, everybody's eating hamburgers and speaking English, talking too loud.
Right.
And so, and I think I think there's a little bit of selection bias for the type of person who leaves their country
Yeah.
and
no,
just goes
that's
somewhere.
a great point.
That's it. Like they're already like, I'm going to succeed.
Yeah.
Like,
It's
I
not
think-
because they're coming from Kenya. It's because
Yeah.
they're the type of person that's
Who would-
willing
yeah,
to
who-
leave.
Which-
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
hopped on the boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if I'd say that as a generational
Well,
one.
the
But
first
I'll just
generation.
put
So
that.
like, hey,
Yeah,
I'm the
so-
first generation. Everything is on me. And what's the saying? Like the first generation builds it.
Because
Second
whenever,
generation sustains it. Third generation.
whenever you're
they-
looking at
they
stats
never-
with immigrants, the number one distinguishing variable is always how far are you from the original person who moved here?
Yeah.
First generation, second generation, and third generation are all drastically different across demographics for immigrants.
I have a question kind of about generations is, I had to read a book once in my class. I don't remember which.
I was wondering who was gonna.
I had to read it 5 times, front to back. Once in time. Not even once in time, I guess, because Alex will just yell at me because there's multiple points, right? Whatever. I had to read a book, and it basically talked about what is the factor of stories told on. So, like, your grandparents probably participated in the civil rights movement. We're probably going through all of that stuff. And what is the factor and the impact of how that lives on in the memory of the people?
Mhm.
Because, like, you probably still, there's probably just this huge, I don't know, you can tell if your grandparents, just the weight of that and difficulties they went through that makes the issue much more real for you
Mhm.
than it might be for somebody who doesn't really have those stories in their background.
Yeah.
So I was just curious if people wanted to talk about that. I was curious with that.
I mean, that's true, but I mean, and you can even say that in a, like, I get the generational thing, so,
'Cause, I
you
mean,
would
is
even do
is
it
it
in-
really done? Is it really over? Is it really as finished, as complete, ended as people think? If you've still got the grandchildren hearing the stories and the same kind of, you've still got the stories of all that stuff coming down.
sure, and I'll just give an example from, so like, people whose line is just like far back has been Christian versus not, right? So I'm technically a second generation Christian, right? My parents are like first generation Christians, right? So, but I went to a Christian high school, Christian middle school, and like we'd have grandparents day, right? And I'd see my peers and classmates who had good relationships with their grandparents, right? But they had stories, and you could tell there was a relationship where their grandparents were able to speak into their faith journey in a way, right? With their stories and their struggles and how they followed Christ for 60 plus years or whatever, right? And I saw that, and I did not have that, right? Like, my grandparents aren't Christian, right? So that was a very different, I recognize that they had a very different experience with their, at least with their grandparents, but maybe just in their overall like formation because of that, right? I also recognize that, like, I told my parents this recently, actually, like, I'm glad I'm not the first generation. Like, that sucks. Like,
Sure.
because their parents, right? Like my grandparents, which are in a way my grandparents, but like my parents, right? Like their parents, right? You can't talk, like, you talk about your faith stuff, right? But that connection isn't there, right? And that to me, and even making it's so much easier to grow up in a Christian household and like keep being Christian if you're raised well, in my opinion, than to decide to become Christian in the first place in a family and a community where none of your friends, peers, family are Christian, right? So very, very different thing. And so I'm in a weird way thankful that I'm the second generation Christian instead of the first generation one. But there is something to say to when you're the first generation, you really own it, right? You have to. Like, obviously, you owned it. Like, that's almost by definition why you're first generation, right? Is because you only became that status because you made some decision, right? Because you owned it in some way. And I mean, I think even if it was from the generational thing, I mean, I think you showed that, and I just was watching the Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro Sunday special. I think it just came out this weekend.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance
And
to see
I
it
mean,
yet.
her point is she's just like her big problem, and she feels like the big issue with the black, like as far as she sees with the black community is buying is this is a general wholesale buying into a victimhood mentality, and she's
Right.
like the solution is you don't be a victim and you take responsibility. And so I mean, and that's in a way that's it, right? Like until like if the kid, right, of a in growing up in Harlem took responsibility and did stuff, we would say, okay, of course he's going to be the person moving out and doing it. It's probably much harder when your entire community is not to make that
Right.
decision, right? And we have to take the selection bias in a way, right? Because like the people who immigrated were essentially a small subset selection of all the people who already chose, hey, I'm going to do something about it, who are moving. But you have to go, what are they? Some like really small subset of the general population and families they lived in, right? And then you would maybe compare that to how many Native people in the U.S. happen to move out or do something in some way, right? It'd be
Right.
maybe that'd be more comparable if you compared local or originating demographics, right? So
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just sort of related to the generational thing, and this does slightly change the topic, but thinking in terms of, would it be better, or do you think it'd be better for the church to focus more on what we need to be doing first versus what's already been done in this, like how much progress has been made on this? Should the church like start with a focus on that as like a way of like saying,
okay.
like a way of saying, hey, it is possible to make progress. Here's what's been done. And like when I look at something like that, I think of like a realistic pacing, because you're not getting a perfect on this issue in one generation.
Mhm.
So saying, well, like even starting, here's how much we've done, so here's how much you can probably expect to see get done in the next X amount of time.
Yeah.
And so like, do you think it'd be a good idea to focus starting with what has already been done in this on this issue?
I mean, you always have to know where you've been before you
Yeah.
can know where you're gonna go.
Yeah, and I
Like,
think
it's kind of a
from
given.
a praise and thankfulness piece, I think that's a huge piece of anything is recognizing here's where we were and here's where we are now, and understanding where we want to go. But like bringing up the Candace Owens piece, as much as people disagree maybe with the form of what she says, I think that might be another place for the church to come in and is saying, all right, cool, like we vote, we go help folks. But I think part of it is all right, telling folks who God says they are and empowering people to, I think I don't know that anybody's figured out a good way to say it at a broad audience right now, but I think that self-empowerment piece is the piece that's not, it's not as public right now, because it is very difficult when people are protesting in the streets, for them to even receive that. And so I think, like, as we're looking at, all right, as Christians, as we're doing different programs and talking to folks, and I think that is a piece of that success, is because if you haven't had that story told to you that here's where our family's been and we haven't done, like, that story is problematic, and it might be as problematic as the environment that a person might grow up in, and that's across race, like wherever you are in the country. And so, yeah, I think the thankfulness piece, and recognizing where we are, but I think the other thing is that, all right, folks realizing what they can do, and and how to deliver that message in a way that's not hurtful. Because in some cases it is very difficult, because if any of us wanted to be professional badminton players from Fort Collins, I literally don't know how, and I'm sure somebody here plays bad, but to get professional level, like, yeah, but if you go to, where's badminton played in Thailand? I feel like Thailand.
Probably.
But, and like, or even like American football. If you said, hey, I live in Vietnam and I want to be an NFL football player. Good luck, man. Like, you're just not going to get any games. And so the idea that self-empowerment piece has its limitations in that in some places folks are just in not a great situation. And so can they get out? Yes, but it's not as easy as do some self-affirmations in the morning and you're going to be okay. Versus if you live in middle-class America, you can go to high school and then figure things out from there and do well. And so it's a tricky balance.
At this point, we're getting into the perspectives on I think the victim mentality perspective is actually saying more about an idea that the person saying that has about race itself.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Right. So I've personally encountered 4 different distinct perspectives on there's what is race and then what do we do about it.
Mhm.
So there's 2 different perspectives on what is race and then 2 ideas of what we do about it on each side.
Okay.
Or I'm
About racism.
about what race is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll just go at the very very simple is, the 2 sides frequently are, one side says race doesn't exist, right?
Okay.
And it says it's not a thing. It doesn't have any effect. We should take it off the census. We should take it off it doesn't matter. You're
Yeah.
all the same.
I'm colorblind.
It's literally, we're literally all the same person.
Or,
We're all,
like,
we're all
more
the
than
same. We're all,
colorblind,
one race, the human race.
it's that it doesn't exist. So like,
It's that it doesn't have any real effect on the
yeah.
real
So
world.
like they're I've heard this idea just very briefly, but it was like there aren't any black people in Jamaica. Everybody's Jamaican. And
Right,
so
yeah.
like only places where you get that race is in non-monolithic cultures, but it is a construct that isn't as concrete as we make it.
Right. So,
Yeah.
there's, and that's the idea, we're all just Americans.
Well, is that
Right.
it shouldn't be a thing, or is that
That it
Yeah.
It's
shouldn't
not a-
be and isn't.
and-
Because it
okay.
isn't. And unless you have a specific law that names race,
Yeah.
there is no effect. And so everything then that happens is a result of individuals' decisions.
Yeah.
So it isn't.
That is the,
So it isn't on a biological level. On what level are we saying it
yes,
isn't?
Yes.
Okay.
Is-
Well. Okay. So.
Right. Yeah. And
Well, we would they would say. I think they wouldn't say it isn't on a sociological level. They would say that's where they would say it should not be a thing on a sociological level, and it isn't maybe because it isn't a thing on a biological level.
frequently. Yes.
Right. That's generally.
And so the idea is, no matter where you are, no matter what you look like, you have the same opportunity as everyone else. Whether or not your outcomes are different is all up to you. That's your fault.
Mhm.
Right. So that's one perspective. The other perspective is no race is real. It has a real effect on you, regardless of other people's biases, regardless of laws. It makes a difference on who you are. And that identity changes how you interact with the world. And that there's implicit, ingrained, unsolvable rules that mediate around that. Right?
Unsolved.
And so that, well, or at least inevitable.
Oh.
Right? There's inevitable sociological facts that come from the difference of race. Whether or not race is biological or not, race still has a sociological impact. And
Yeah.
always will. Right? So that's the other side. And that's the side that says, no, 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 you can't just tell me to figure it out because our situations are different. Not everyone's on the same playing field. It is fundamentally and intrinsically structured.
Mhm.
And that's where you get intersectionality and critical race theory. That's what intersectionality and critical race theory is.
Right.
I guess there is actually a third position now that I think about it, which is that, race may be real and it may be actually correlated to things, but the way we deal with it is not set in stone and there are no inevitabilities. Or at least that the inevitabilities, there's, in that side, there's like, yes, there's inevitabilities, but then there's two sides on like what those inevitabilities are.
Or you can move.
Yeah.
You can get on a boat and go to another place and
Right, yeah.
Right.
break whatever.
And then, there's, within that, there's a whole slew of things because there are people who subscribe to critical race theory who say we just can't have integrated societies because they're always prejudiced.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
that's that is one conclusion that intersectionality and critical race theorists come to.
Right. Yeah, and for it is 9/11, and so I do want to just wrap it up. If people want to stick around and we still talk more, I'm totally game for it. I want to respect anybody that wants to take off. I want to just touch on really quick just to explain what critical race theory is for anybody that watches this later or is watching now. Just because I think that's important enough that it's an issue that we need to hit. So I'll kind of give my explanation of it, and if anybody wants to throw in something else that they think is important with it.
You attach the videos we watched too.
Yeah, so we'll also, if you guys are watching online or you're watching, I'll put a link in the description. There's a really good video that explains this really, really well. But critical theory is basically, it's an idea, you're looking at all sorts of different things, not just race, you're looking at gender, you're looking at sexual identities, different things like that, and basically putting people into two categories of you are either the oppressor or the oppressed based upon your race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all of these different things. And in one sense or another, almost critical theory kind of says your value, or at least your moral authority, is based on how many of those categories you fit into the oppressed category. And therefore, those who are in the oppressor category are naturally not just the people in power, but they are establishing oppression upon the people in the minority that are the oppressors in that. And it doesn't even matter in this view if you are a white male who actually is looking to bring equality to everyone, you are still viewed as an oppressor and unjust because of the fact that you are in the oppressor roles in these categories. And then the oppressors also are the ones that are supposed to then revolt against and fight against the oppressor in that. This is, and there's different levels that everyone takes regarding critical theory of how much they buy into all that, but that's like kind of a summarized version of how it kind of works. And it's important for us to know that as Christians, because ultimately this is kind of hinted at there being kind of a Trojan horse within Black Lives Matter movement. This is one of the things that's kind of being proposed within some of the people within that movement that really goes against the biblical standard, because now your value is really rated upon you being the oppressed. Where if you're the oppressor, you don't have value, you don't have say, you can't speak into moral issues because you're the oppressor. And that's not a biblical standard. That's not a biblical viewpoint. And so that's something that we need to be aware of and be able to speak up, out, and against as Christians regarding this stuff. So
The only
that's a quick summary. And then,
modification-
yeah,
I
I'd
would
love
add a
anybody
few
else to add
points.
anything to it, for.
So the basis of, I call it intersectionality theory.
Yeah, and
they're-
intersectionality generally will see, like, you can have critical race theory. That's
Right.
only race, that's only applying all of this oppressor oppressed to race.
So
And
yeah,
then you can have critical gender theory.
critical theory.
When you're looking at
intersectionality
all
theory.
of it, that's the intersectionality is looking at, okay, well, you're, Katie is white, so she's an oppressor, but she's a female, so she's oppressed. And
Right.
so those intersect in different ways. That's what
Right, yeah, yeah.
intersectionality
So
plays out.
the founding principle is norms are oppressive. So that's number one. That's premise number one. Norms are oppressive. Norms fall along and norms benefit people who already naturally fit into them. Norms oppress people who don't. Right? Ergo, whatever the norm is defines the oppressor. Right? And so that just ends up being the majority.
Mhm.
Right? The majority always oppresses the minority. And furthermore, all oppression, this is the other fundamental principle. Right? So that's one fundamental principle. The other fundamental principle is all oppression is linked and a result of itself. So if you're oppressed for being one identity, it's because you're being oppressed for this identity and vice versa. Because you're not fitting into this norm, you're oppressed for not fitting into this norm as well. So that's how they intersect. That's what the intersection is all oppression is linked. It's all the same. And therefore, and that's why if you fit into the oppressor in one category, you fit into the oppressor in all categories. So in order to have the moral high ground, you have to fit into the oppressed in all categories. Otherwise, you still
Right.
have privilege
Yep.
in one category. And if you have it in one category, you have it in all categories.
Anybody else want to add anything to that? I think that was just a good thing to kind of finish with. I'll pray us out. If you guys want to chat more, then maybe I'll leave the live stream going for people that want to keep on listening or watching later. But then I'll cut it off if we're just ready to get into other topics or whatever. So, do you want to pray? Sure. You want to try? Yes.
Oh, Father, we come before you tonight. We thank you for our time together. We thank you for just a space and to come in and share ideas and that different things around. God, we ask for your wisdom on how to approach racism and any other of the other isms that our country is dealing with. Give us wisdom to speak to others. Give us wisdom to listen to others. And God, we just thank you for healing as more than anything. God, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for the great conversation. We ask that this will be a catalyst to more conversations and to wisdom to do your will on earth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to throw out any more that wants to stick around? If anybody wants to go, you're welcome to go at any time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I studied this a lot in college. So
Yeah.
this was
Yeah,
my major,
For your major, that makes
sociology and
absolute
criminology.
sense.
So
Yeah.
Well,
this
Yeah.
is, and then,
I'm just grabbing more water.
yeah,
Yeah, so, no, here, you wanna hear the question first?
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question. Should the church, put essentially extra or a special effort into being diverse within a local community? And should it be like extraordinarily diverse? Should it be just to say, someone could make the argument to the level of diversity in the local community, so i.e. we should be as approximately representative of the community surrounding us? Or do different communities that are the different people in the community tend to congregate together in particular ways, and they're just kind of cool hanging out with each other at their own local congregations, right? So that's all. That's been a church
That's a great
question. I don't know what people think
but my answer's just flat no, honestly.
on which.
Don't force diversity.
Okay.
you're never gonna, it's never gonna be a happy ending, because no one's there because they want to be, or if you're filling quotas, right?
Okay, so what if we feel we're, like, what if the church feels we are not diverse simply because we're only putting our outreach to a certain group of people and ignoring other people in our community? Should they change that then?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a problem. You should be evangelizing to every single person you meet.
Sure.
And if you happen to convince, and actually the thing is that each individual, because of the corollary to culture that there is more likely to convert people who are more like them.
Sure, I agree.
So, I mean, your demographics are going to naturally replicate.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing,
Okay.
because you're going to have a different community over here with a different makeup who's going to be replicating theirs at the same
Sure.
time, right? When I look at it, this may just be my perspective, coming from a more hierarchical
Yep.
background.
Yep.
My church is diverse. My parish isn't. My parish is almost exclusively white. But the church is very diverse. Africa is one of the, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, even, like some of the biggest churches of Orthodoxy are in the Middle East,
Mhm.
in Lebanon and in Syria.
Oh, yeah.
The Patriarch of Antioch
Mhm.
is Syrian, right? So yeah, my church is diverse.
Mhm.
Does that mean my individual parish has to be diverse? No.
Sure.
And even, I might add, it might be better this way, because if you don't have cultures forced to mix, then the beauty of each culture separately can be preserved, right? I wouldn't want to go to a church in the Middle East and try to force, uh, practices that have evolved in America onto them, because they have their own practices, right? I wouldn't say, oh, I wouldn't go into an American church, right, and say, oh, you're not diverse enough. We need to get people from this group and this group and this group and this group and this group. We all have to meld our traditions together. No. Have your culture, let it be separate, let it exist as its own thing. You'll trade with others, there'll be interaction, but just let it be. You don't have to force something into it.
Would you say, though, that there needs to be, and I think, like, you could talk about this either on a church level, we're talking church level, you could talk about this on a country level as well, right? Like, there has to be some overarching unifying principles or something that holds all these diverse cultures together.
I think the church.
The church.
Has that.
The church, right? So for the church, we would say you have general belief systems, and then we would say maybe on the level of traditions, it changes, at least in Orthodoxy. What would you say would you say that would be the difference between what's unity and what's diversity?
Like,
Right.
we all believe the same things. Our catechism is all the same.
Mhm.
We all, all our, the boss of my church talks to the boss of everyone else's church, right?
Yeah.
And they all get together, they all meet, they're all in unity, right? Even if they're separate. It's not a hegemonic institution like the Catholic Church is, but so I can't speak to that. But, so yeah, the unity is the church. The unity is the faith itself. The faith itself is the unity. And then different ways to express that piety can vary in as many ways as there are people,
Mhm.
right? But we all serve the same God. We all have the same faith, even if we express it differently. And keeping those unique expressions alive is valuable, I think.
Mhm. So here's
That's the other part.
So here's and this is maybe just more a question to Orthodoxy, not knowing as much about it. So like, say even I'll just give an example from Catholic Church. It's super easy to do with Protestantism, but I need the unifying aspect. With the Catholic Church, right? Let's say you have like the Catechism, right? Like here's our central dogma and doctrines, right? But then you have different rites that would probably hold different, slightly different, like things that aren't spelled out, different rights and stuff will hold different interpretations or views on various theological issues, right? That cool in the Orthodox Church? Like,
So yeah, you're referring to Latin versus Byzantine, right?
I mean,
Something.
there's
Yeah.
there's multiple different rights in the
There's a lot, but
Yeah.
those are the main ones.
Sure.
And like, I mean, we don't really have various rights
Mhm.
in the same way as they do.
Sure, but is it like you
Um,
would have like with different congregations, as best as I can put it, areas hold things that aren't explicitly spelled out, say in like the central doctrine.
There are
Would there be variation
there
in
are spelled out
theological thought?
doctrines that give priests discretion with dealing with individual issues. So it's up to the individual priest who might feel that a different response is needed for an individual case, but only in areas where he's specifically been given discretion.
Okay.
And usually in those cases, if it warrants it, he might say, I'm going to talk to the bishop and see if this warrants an exception. So you make the exception if you think it's necessary. If not, you send it up the chain, and ask, should we make, but no huge doctrinal things.
Are there any differences in interpretation of passages
No.
or?
And if, when there's a schism, that's how Catholicism happened. Right, I mean,
Yeah, sure, actually, true enough.
I mean, but like say in the Catholic Church, right? Because we've debated this, right? It's more a philosophical issue, right? It's like how does God's what is the relationship between God and future actions, right? Like in terms of God's foreknowledge, does he have it? How does he have it? What does it mean? Et cetera, et cetera. And the two big strains of the Catholic Church are Thomism and Molinism, right? And they debated for a long time, and then the Holy See came down and said, you guys can't accuse each other of heresy, but we're not ruling one way is right or not. So it's perfectly orthodox to hold one philosophical position or the other. But
generally we solve that problem by saying, if you're splitting hairs that much, you're probably asking the wrong question. Is basically like, at that point, you're getting into the weeds of, esoteric Eastern philosophy, which is less scholastic than the Western
Sure.
way of doing things.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't, actually, I do have an example. The Coptics
Okay.
have a very different way of describing things.
Mhm.
And the Coptic Church and the Oriental Church were actually both like minor schisms that recently healed and were brought back into the greater church, because basically a while ago they decided, hang on, you're not actually saying anything different than us, you're just saying it different. So that happens, where we realize we're having an argument over nothing, you just have a different way of putting it than I do. But
Sure.
we're saying the same thing.
Sure.
That's the only thing I can think of.
Okay. Because it was more like we may agree on the like base doctrine, like God has foreknowledge of future events or something like that, right? But like how that cashes itself out, philosophically anyway, maybe a point of legitimate disagreement that people like the church as an overall is like, yeah, well, those things both seem plausible. Like we agree on this main point that God knows what's going to happen in the future. And then exactly how that cashes it out, we just like, yeah, people debate that and it's not a settled issue kind of a thing. Right?
It's more like, you're probably both right. Now stop worrying about it and go,
Sure.
go to mass. Kind of thing. Stop worrying about it, go to church. It's not important. Is usually the answer.
Do we have any more questions on racism? Just because
Yeah, sorry.
if not, I'll cut the stream, which is fine.
Yeah,
I
and
have one, and then if I put it out.
Yeah.
We talked about different, like, how different programs hit, like welfare hit, and how different things with the drug war. Has anyone ever has there ever been data where you've looked at the white people in the same communities and the same poverty levels and such, and cut them off from the other white people and just compared whether they've been hit the same way? I'm
I've
just
seen
curious.
people
I mean,
of different races in the
like-
same class have been hit the same way. What's the last
People
name?
of different races in the same culture, so like in the same part of Harlem, in the same da 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 da. Has anyone ever seen any data where they've cut off the rest of
Yes.
the white population?
I mean,
actually
so,
seeing what
like-
the difference, if there was more difference going past that, or if it was literally just the same impact as a result of
This
the
is gonna
same
be a lot of jargon, but
systematic
Yeah.
racism, what we called. Lost?
I don't know much, but it sounds
Accounting,
like
so-
Ethan does.
accounting for location, city, urban versus rural, and income. The only variable that had statistically significant effect on the correlation between race and any of these outcomes was urban versus rural. That was the only significant variable that changed the numbers when looking at the correlation between race, drug use, arrest, crime, any of the above.
So like, if you were in the city, it was more racially biased.
If you're in
One
the
way.
city, there's higher crime.
Yep.
Than in the rural.
So you,
There's more proximity.
But like
No, but like
Income?
between the two races.
income, right? So if you have people of two races, you have four people, right? Two races, two places, right? One pair is in the country, one pair is in the city. That's going to be substantially different. These two are going to end up more like each other than their counterpart in the city, right? But if you do the same thing, two pairs, two incomes, the income number, adding in, well, let's test for income among these two pairs, there was no significant change in the overall final number.
so like people of similar income, so like this pair would be treated very similarly, and this pair would be treated very
Well,
similarly.
it's not about how they're treated, it's about the outcomes.
Or would have, this pair would have very similar outcomes, and this pair would have very similar outcomes,
No,
regardless
the
of race.
race would have similar outcomes regardless of income.
Okay,
So even accounting for, accounting for low income, the racial trend still held. Accounting for urban versus rural, the racial trends did not hold. And urban versus rural was the only place where the trends did not hold when accounting for those other variables.
Maybe
and the
that's-
trend is
So it
one
means-
race being
More criminogenic than the other.
more criminally,
Whether that is arrest rates, accusation rates, or, if you take it outside of, so there's two main databases when looking at crime. There's the Uniform Crime Report, which is all police data. So arrests, sentences, convictions, etc. That's all over here. A lot of people rightly claim that's biased because we don't catch everybody, right? Or we might catch one group of people unfairly more. So then you look at the other one, which is the National Crime Victimization Index or something. National Crime Victimization Survey. There it is. Which is a self-report. Have you been a victim of a crime, and who did it? Or who do you think did it? So when you take those two together, you get a pretty complete idea of what crime looks like, and you can extrapolate from the differences between them what the underreport rate is, and say, oh, and if we continue this trend with this trend, and then we put the trends together, then we can get a complete idea. And so my point in saying all this is you look at this, so you have victimization, you have who's the victim, you have who's the perpetrator, you have who gets arrested more, who gets arrested less, or who's getting arrested and who's committing different things, right? And then you can also say, what's their income? Because then you pair it with census data. You say, what's their income? What's the, and then you can take from that, target individual studies places. But basically, the only major factor that, confounded the race correlation to criminality or even to arrest rates. So we take away criminality, we're just saying people who've been arrested, whether they're guilty or not. that correlation to race also did not change with any variable except for urban versus rural.
Well, I think that's not quite what my question was. Because what I'm saying is, go to an urban area.
So like take somebody from a predominantly white neighborhood
One
to a
block-
predominantly
next block
black
over?
neighborhood.
No, because I'm talking statistics.
Okay.
So I'm talking groups of people. So go to urban area, looking in there, take all the people of equal income,
Mhm.
in the equal area, the white group and the black group. And when something like welfare hits, was the same impact of drugs and was the same impact on fatherlessness observed in both groups? Or was it still more in the black group than the white group? With the same area and the same income and therefore as close as you can get to the same culture, but there will still be the racial difference of the culture, which you can't remove. That's what I'm curious about.
I think it's hard because I think people would argue that's maybe a difficult task because we would just say that the areas are racially segregated, right? So you'll never get
Yeah.
the same area close enough in culture or otherwise to be able to do that kind of
I was just getting I
analysis.
haven't heard anything that.
Yeah.
So but that would be my guess.
No,
of
I
maybe
there
why
there
but
is the problem of
It'd be hard.
people do tend to self-segregate themselves. People tend to live with people who live near people who look like themselves, and that's just the trend across everywhere.
Right.
So trying to get like a mixed neighborhood survey would be difficult, but you could get to adjacent neighborhoods, and accounting for that, as far as I know, last time I checked the data, including with welfare recipients rates, the racial correlation was still there, non-mediated by income so like the racial trends still were in effect even when accounting for
Equal
income,
income
location.
and basically equal area.
Yeah.
Okay, see, because that would point at almost something else too, more than just the welfare and the
Right. And some of that can be,
policy. Because if it's true that the welfare and policy both hit, and there's still a difference in two places that have the basically same culture and same place, then the
It
only
does
different
assume
factor
that
is
they have the same culture just because they're in the same area,
Which is hard to
Which is-
figure out.
which
Yeah.
is what that suggests is that there's not the same culture, is what that
Right.
data would suggest.
Or you would suggest that the cultures are similar enough that the skin color is the main factor. That's why I'm curious if people would.
And that's becomes the question of how separate can you make them really?
right.
Okay, we'll probably have to hit on.
I don't know. I've been doing a lot of thinking about like
Don't
what
feel like you need to stick around either.
what are like some legal solutions to the problem.
I think a lot of it needs to be, well,
Yeah,
for some of it, I would say a lot of it needs to be reform of the prison system and criminal.
I would tend to agree. Yeah, like
Because like the example I gave of, is it really helping the most to get rid of the drug problem by sending somebody to jail? Or would it be better to treat them for their addiction
and
and
that's a philosophical
them-
problem, right? The
Oh.
question is, how should we get people to stop doing things? Should we teach them what to do or make them afraid of what not to do?
right,
And it's
Yeah.
like, and you can, so it's like deterrence versus rehabilitation is the
Right.
real philosophical debate. And I think that we be able to look at and say it depends, because it does depend. It works
Right.
differently. The single most effective deterrence policy in America is the sex offender registry. As soon as that was implemented, we saw a 11% decrease in both recidivism and original crime. When that was in areas where the registry, which is
Yeah.
massive.
Yeah.
Deterrence, like the death
Do you
penalty.
think that would be effective with drugs?
No, I don't think so. Because then you just, who else does drugs near me? Hey, let's get blazed.
fair. Yeah, no, that wouldn't work.
It's like LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're in the same stuff as I am.
Oh, man. Crazy.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, the most compelling research I've seen done on drugs in particular
Mhm.
is so early prohibition, like the early idea for prohibition, what it first started to be and what it evolved into are two very different things. Early prohibition was it's illegal, it's legal to buy it, it's legal to transport it, it's legal to own it. It's illegal to consume it in public. But everything else is legal,
Keep it house.
right? Keep it in your home,
Don't worry about
take it to and from the liquor store, you just can't do it in public. And that reduced alcohol consumption colossally. When they said,
Makes
okay,
sense.
now it's just illegal, bang, can't do it at all. Alcohol consumption shot up before pre-prohibition levels.
Yeah.
To above pre-prohibition levels, excuse me.
Yeah.
We also saw that with marijuana, heroin, and cocaine. We made them
Right.
all blanket illegal and use shot up,
Mhm.
right? So the question is, why don't, if that works for one substance, things that work for controlling one substance work for controlling another substance. In almost all cases that I can think of.
Hmm.
So why don't we just take what worked for prohibition and apply it to drugs now? You can buy it, sell it, consume it in your home, do not consume it in public. And then, maybe not make it a huge jail time, because obviously huge jail times don't work. So what do? We find someone in public smoking it. You do what the movie theaters do. You take their shit and bid them good day. You say, okay, that's mine now. I confiscate this. You are using it in public, and therefore it is property of the state now. And that is the fine. You take their drugs, right? Write them a ticket for it. Or a receipt here's a receipt for your drugs. You've been accused of, you can come get them back in the next 10 days if you think that you weren't using in public, just like a traffic ticket. But yeah, we see you consuming in public, we take your stuff.
I mean, obviously the pushback would be hard drugs. It seems like they would have somehow a different way that would work out when it comes to like crack, heroin, meth, like when people can easily find those things. And
Okay, but you can easily find them now.
I just think I think of me being a kid who grew up, knowing and granted, like if somebody offered me drugs like that, I would have said no. But I think there's, especially with younger kids, that, and I guess maybe you put an age limit like we do again with the other drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I would
and
put an age
alcohols.
limit on it, 100%.
I don't know. I just feel like I'd have to.
There would be
think about it.
pushback.
I've never
People-
heard that idea at all.
Yeah, I mean, there would be pushback to it. People wouldn't like it because boomers exist, and boomers have this idea. They're still stuck in Reaganite era, where just don't, just say no or whatever, and we have to demonize anyone who looks at drugs or whatever. But that
Don't vote
hasn't
for it.
worked. That's been
Right.
been a shitty idea. It
Mhm.
has been terrible for everybody involved. The number one, like, war on drugs started with Nixon, right? And immediately, cop deaths shot up. Civilian deaths, serving warrants, shot up. Civilian distrust of police skyrocketed. And it's been going up since. All three of those things have been going up since. Before the drug, and the same thing happened with Prohibition. They went up, Prohibition ended, immediately people trust the cops again, there's less deaths on both sides.
Right.
Immediately. And so that is where things like enforcement comes in, So the
Right.
reason that you make it legal in the home is because the most damaging part about the drug war is what? No-knock raids.
Right.
Busting down people's doors at 3 a.m.,
Yeah.
throwing them on the ground, shooting their dog, and searching their entire house, arresting everyone in it. Right? That's if I'm